We warn you, I'm very excited actually about this one. I don't know why, but lately railroad car ferries have sort of caught my interest. And last Saturday, I was at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Festival watching other presentations, so I'm really amped up to get back to doing it again. So I will try my best not to get carried away and get you out of here within my time frame. Today will throw something at me if I start getting too long-winded. So, on the Great Lakes, we had a really interesting thing where for a number of decades, the railroads actually sailed their trains across the Great Lakes. And you have to start with a real interesting question of why? They're trains. They have tracks all over. Why are they sailing these things across the lakes? And obviously whenever you have boats sailing, there are accidents, and there are 3.5 car ferries at the bottom of the Great Lakes. I've been teasing with that for a whole month, and everyone's like, where's that half a wreck? Stay tuned, I put that at the end just to make sure you know what it is. But you have to start with a real simple question of why, and I really couldn't figure out for a long time. The car ferries started really around the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, a couple years after. And you have a lot of your manufacturing at that time, Detroit, Toledo, Cleveland, Buffalo. And so once you load the cars, hook up the train, and we all know Chicago down here is a major train hub, why wouldn't you just keep right on rolling through Chicago and keep going west? Where does the Great Lakes fit into all this? And what I learned, at least for the one company, the Ann Arbor Railroad, and logic would say that it's pretty similar to the other companies, is Chicago was not the most efficient with their setup. So they could send a train to Chicago, and those cars might sit there for a week. Something with the switching of engines, and basically, my understanding, I'm not a railroad guy. I probably should have asked my uncle who is, but I was afraid the answer would take me too long to get. But
Chicken?
But basically, my understanding is the train cars got to Chicago, and they had to take their place in line for the next available engine going the way they were going. And they might sit there for a week, and it was costing the train companies some serious money. So what they started doing to solve this problem is Lake Michigan is the epicenter of the car ferries. There was one fleet that was taking them across Lake Erie to Canada, but most of the fleets are taking them up to Frankfort, Ludington, Grand Haven, a little bit in Muskegon. They're sailing them across to Wisconsin and then sending them further west. So their answer to this problem was they created their own fleet of specially designed railroad car ferries. And it's important to understand, for some of these stories I have for you, these fleets were run by the railroad. This was not a third-party company. They were owned and operated by the train company. They were, in essence, an extra car on the train. They were part of their setup. A little bit about the car ferries. To understand what's going on in some of these stories, this is one that's still around, built in the 1920s. This is the city of Milwaukee. Interestingly, she was built as a replacement for one I'll tell you about later. And you can go to Manistee and go aboard this one. You'll notice it's backed into the dock. And that was the whole concept. They were called railroads. Roll on, roll off. If you know anything about railroads, they want to be as efficient as possible, except that whole Chicago problem they had. So the whole idea was the ferries loaded with train cars, they come into the port, they turn around, they back into the dock, they lock into the rails, and there is an engine warmed up, ready to go, and they're going to pull the cars off, and there's another set waiting to get pushed on, and the ferries back out again. They really don't waste much time. When you get on the car deck, this main deck, you can see it's just covered in tracks, usually 4. 2 on each side of midships. And they had a whole setup on how to load it. So they would just roll the cars on. They didn't have to unload them or anything like that. The docks were set up so when the ship was secured, the rails lined up with rails on shore. And so they could just push them right on with an engine. And you can see a box car here. Now the one problem with putting boxcars, or other types of train cars, on a boat is boats move. They roll side to side, they pitch up and down. We all know train cars are on wheels. Moving boats, things on wheels, bad combination. But they got really heavy duty. You can see these jacks. Every boxcar would have one on each corner. And they wrench those up tight. They have these chocks down here to keep the wheels from sliding. And off they would go. Really funny story. I took the tour on this one. And just off the picture to the left, there is a stairway that leads from the car deck up topside. And if you stand at the bottom of that ladder leans like this. Because one of those jacks gave way one time in its life and a boxcar tipped over and bent the ladder. So you're actually climbing a ladder that's crooked. Always a little bit of fun. So, like I said, Lake Michigan was the epicenter of the car ferries. They're going from Ludington, Grand Haven, Frankfurt. They're going to, the Ann Arbor line actually ran up to Menominee, Michigan for a while. Milwaukee, Manitowoc, Kenosha. And for a lot of years, a lot of decades, you're just going to have this cross-lake traffic going back and forth. They'll load, go across the lake, they'll unload their cars, load the next one, and come back. Some cases, they might make 2 round trips per 24 hours. The car ferries were the first real heavy-duty ships on the Great Lakes. They were the first icebreakers. Everyone else, if you read any Great Lakes stories, they always talk about winter layup. Sailors always look forward to December or January. The boat gets laid up, and they get a couple months off where they can stay warm at home. Not if you were a car ferry sailor. They ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, even through the ice. Mostly, if they could. There was one story, one of the Ann Arbor boats was locked in the ice off Milwaukee for almost 2 straight months. But barring some really heavy ice, they're running year-round. In the start, you're going to have the Pere Marquette fleet, the Grand Trunk, and the Ann Arbor. Later, some of those names will change. Toward the end of the car ferry days, C&O will be running some, but in the early years, these are the major players running these car ferries. One last thing about the design of car ferries. Here's one that's leaving port. You can see, here's the car deck. So here's where the railroad cars will get taken on and off the boat. And what you'll notice, you can see a little guy standing here. He's on that main deck. He's not very far off of the water. You'll also notice there's nothing on the back of that boat to keep the water out. And that, believe it or not, is by design. Now, sailors look at that and go, that's really dumb. Generally speaking, I want something steel to keep water out of my boat. But the railroads, remember, they're all on efficiency. You want to arrive on time, you want to leave on time. They don't want to take precious minutes opening some sort of sea gate to get the cars off. They want to start unloading as soon as that boat is secured at the dock. So by design, they left the stern of their boats open to the seas. There are going to be some people who are going to regret that decision. Now, I have to admit, this presentation is a little bit of a nightmare for me. I'm a history guy, not a math guy, and every single car ferry name has a number in it. So if you start getting confused because they all have the same name, don't worry, I did too. The first one, the Marquette and Bessemer #2. After I just got done telling you that Lake Michigan was the center of all this activity, the first story I have for you takes place on Lake Erie, of course. Some stats on this one. It was launched in 1905. At 350 feet long, she was a tank of her day. This is a very large boat. And she sails for the Marquette and Bessemer Dock and Navigation Company. That's the only time I'm going to say that name tonight. That is a long company name right there. Her job, she is going to be hauling cars from Conway, Ohio, back and forth to Port Stanley, Ontario. So she's going to be crossing the international border, and that is her job day in and day out, just back and forth. And once I looked at the map, I realized, you know, they want efficiency, they're into moving cargo, and they're crossing the lake at the widest part of Lake Erie. But hey, I didn't make the map. Believe it or not, on the Great Lakes, December 7th was famous long before Pearl Harbor. In 1909, the Marquette and Bessemer #2 takes off from Conway, her normal route, normal day's work. And the forecast doesn't give much cause for concern. It says it's going to be cold, it's going to get colder, west winds are going to diminish. Thursday's supposed to be a nice day. Nothing this boat can't handle. Famous last words, because what actually hits is a massive gale. Now this was a bad week on Lake Erie. Before the storm hit, there was actually another ship that sank in a collision and one that burned. And then the storm hit and took not just the car ferry, but 2 other ships as well. One thing about the car ferries is even though they tried to stay on time, they weren't very good at it, because typically when they ran into weather, they got delayed. They didn't have the power to keep up the speed that they normally had, so there was no real concern right away when the Marquette and Bessemer was overdue. But eventually, they're going to learn that it did go down. The William B. Davitt, who incidentally will go down later in another famous storm in 1940 in Lake Michigan, sails through a bunch of wreckage by Long Point, and a lot of upper work cabin type stuff, and it's painted green, which they knew was the color that the Bessemer was painted, and so they became very, very convinced that the Marquette and Bessemer #2 had gone down. And then the lake always ends up giving up some sort of evidence, and 2 lifeboats are going to be found from the Bessemer. This one comes ashore, and there's nine guys in a pile of clothes in the lifeboat. And so really kind of sad. Most of the guys were huddled over top of one other sailor, so it became evident that one guy was probably struggling in the temperatures and the elements a little bit more, and they tried to shield him with their bodies. They tried to share body heat to keep their shipmate alive. And unfortunately, none of them made it. And then there was just a pile of clothes in the bottom of the lifeboat. And what they assume happened is there was a 10th person in the lifeboat who, through the shock and the stress of what they were going through, literally went insane and took his clothes off and made a swim for shore. And they never did find that body. Another lifeboat is picked up by a passing steamer with 3 more bodies in it. And there's an interesting legend about that lifeboat. And I could not find anything in the newspapers that proved it right. But in this lifeboat, supposedly, was the body of the cook, still in his white apron. And into the gunnels of the lifeboat, so the rails here are along the side, was jammed the cook's 2 heavy meat cleavers, which got some attention. When you're abandoning a sinking ship, grabbing your meat cleaver is probably not the first thing that crosses most people's mind. And they were really wondering why, what happened. And as the legend goes, the next spring, the captain's body was found, and it had large gashes in it from a knife. And so they speculated perhaps the captain tried to prevent his crew from abandoning ship, trying to save the ship, something like that. That I read in a history book. I could not find anything in the newspapers about this story, so I honestly don't know if it's true or not. But as they say, when myth becomes legend, rent the legend. So maybe it's true, maybe it's not. A lot of the bodies they found were bruised and cut, though. That part is true. So not necessarily cut with a meat cleaver, but clearly these guys were abandoning ship and taking a beating while doing it. Something severely violent happened to the Marquette and Bessemer. And so the lake starts letting people know that everyone is gone. There's always that one person who comes out after a ship goes down and says, I had a premonition about that. It's really easy to have a premonition on December 8th when the ship sinks after. Sailor John Clancy, his sister, said, yeah, I had a dream the night it went down that something happened to John's boat, and all the men were lost. All 38 went down with it. Whether she did or didn't, I don't know, but it made a good newspaper story anyway. Some reporter got a good paycheck for that. John Wirtz actually wrote, and he said, this boat is terrible. It's not safe. It is in bad shape. This is going to be my last trip. I am not sailing. And he even mentioned that open stern design. He said, this is just bad. I'm going to go get on an oar boat, some boat that's safer. I can't do this. Fortunately, he waited one trip too long. There was questions about how it was loaded. Most of the cars were loaded with coal, but 3 or 4 were loaded with iron beams for building a bridge. And of course, iron's a lot heavier than coal, so there was some question. No one knows exactly where on the boat the heavier cars were put. Were they put all together? Was it off balance? This article actually says that the iron beams were placed across the top of the railroad cars, and I have a hard time believing that. Because once you load the cars, get them secured, how are you going to be picking up these beams and laying them across the top? I don't see, that doesn't make sense. I think some reporter got their facts a little wrong. I believe that they were inside the cars. Mr. Harrich was safe. He was actually in the hospital when his ship sailed from Conowit. Now, it didn't say if he was sick or if he'd been injured, but fortunately, weird to say that, but fortunately he was in the hospital, so he survived. And then there was, on the crew list, they printed a list of everyone that was lost in the Marquette and Bessemer #2, including Porter Stewart. Porter meaning he worked in the galley. They assumed he was lost on the boat. All hands lost. He was on the crew list. Until he came walking into the company offices 2 weeks later and said, "Hi everybody, I'm here." He actually missed the boat when it left Port Stanley to come back to Conowit for the last time. So he was left ashore, and when it was coming back to Port Stanley, it sank. No one at this point in the offices in Ohio knew that he had missed the boat, so they all assumed he'd gone down with it, until literally, quite literally, he walks through the front door and proves them wrong 2 weeks later. I would have loved to have been in the office at that point. There's always that one person that shows up a week or two later. I'm noticing a pattern in all these stories. The question then becomes, what happened to the Marquette and Bessemer? Where did it go? There were a lot of sightings throughout that whole night. So it leaves Conowit, and they're pretty sure right away that it's near shore somewhere, because there were a lot of people who either saw it or claimed they heard it. And that's a pretty accurate thing to use, because remember, these car ferries, they went from one port to another and back. They didn't go all over the Great Lakes. So these two towns would have seen this boat at least once every day. And one thing about steam whistles is they're all just slightly different. Even if they're the exact same whistle, made of the exact same plant, doesn't matter. If you listen to them side by side, they can be a slightly different pitch. And these people listen to those whistles literally 365 days a year, and they pick up on that. And so they could tell, whether they couldn't see these ferry boats, but a lot of people could tell just from the whistle sound which one was coming into town. So the night, or the afternoon after it leaves Conowit, a Canadian customs officer sees it off Port Stanley. And with the storm picking up, they can't get into the harbor, they can't make it through the piers, and he sees, not just hears the whistle, he physically sees the Marquette and Bessemer turn west, and presumably looking for shelter somewhere. The night of the 7th, it's heard just to the east of Conowit. So perhaps the captain turned around and came back across the lake, hoping to get back into Conowit. 1:30 in the morning of the 8th, it is heard just west of Conowit. And here's where things get interesting. Supposedly an hour and a half later, it's back across the lake off Port Stanley. Now this is normally about a 5-hour trip, so he can't be, someone goofed there. One of those two was false, but they were people listening to the whistles, so we really don't know. By 5 a.m., someone heard a steamer whistle just east of Port Stanley, and he said it was really close. He actually thought a ship had gone aground, it was so close to shore. And he never did see it, but he did report hearing it. So you can see, it really kind of looks like the captain was going back and forth across the lake looking for somewhere to hide. And the general thinking is that in the process of making those turns, at some point he has to turn that open stern to the waves, right? And these waves are going to pile in and flood the ship. Perhaps the railroad cars shifted. Those ones loaded with the heavy iron bars may have may have shifted over. I'd love to tell you the condition of the wreck, the evidence that we have found on the wreck, but no one's found the wreck yet. So the rest of the story is waiting to be told. They're looking all over for it. And it's really interesting that no one's found it, because the average depth of Lake Erie is only like about 60 feet.
Yeah,
It's a very shallow lake. But there is a deep hole somewhere right out in here, I'm told, and people think it may have gone down in that hole. And if it's on the Canadian side, I don't hunt shipwrecks myself, but I've talked to people who do, and they tell me that the rules that Canada has for searching in their waters can be tricky. So not a lot of people are going over there and looking. There's another theory out there. Lake Erie has a really weird bottom to it. It's not your typical sand, it's not rock. It's like this really mucky, gooey quicksand. And there's some people that say that the Marquette and Bessemer number 2 sank twice. There are some people who say that it's under the muck and will never be found. That has happened. There is a shipwreck on Lake Erie that was discovered, and divers went back later and it sunk into the mud. It's completely buried now. So there is a precedent for that. It has happened. Now, a 350-foot steel car ferry, that might be a little bit difficult to believe, but hopefully at some point someone will find it. We can tell the rest of the story. Going back to Lake Michigan now. Once again, we're back to the numbers. Always have numbers. The Pere Marquette 18. It's a little bit older than the last boat I told you about, built in 1902. It's also a little bit shorter at 338 feet, but she's going to sail for the Pere Marquette fleet out of Ludington. Excuse me. And her main job is to go from Ludington to Milwaukee and back, carrying, same basic job, carrying rail cars back and forth. Except for a couple of summers. The summers of 1907, 08, 09, 1910, it's actually leased out to another company out of Chicago. You'll notice in this picture, that's a lot of people out on deck. Business apparently was a little bit slow. And there was this excursion company in Chicago, asked the Pere Marquette company if they could lease one of their car ferries as an excursion boat. So they sent the 18 down, and they outfitted it with stuff for tourists. It was a day trip boat, so they'd leave Chicago, cruise along the Wisconsin shoreline, Kenosha, Milwaukee, and then come back. They actually covered the railroad tracks on the car deck with wood and made it a huge dance floor. There was a band in there, and it was a day excursion boat. And then when fall came, all the tourists went away in Chicago, they sent it back to Ludington, and she went back to doing what she was built to do, and that's all rail cars. The story is Captain Peter Kilty, when it came back in 1910, was very upset at the condition of his boat. He said it was not in real good shape after being used as a tourist boat. At one point it's said that he banged on the hull with his elbow and said you could have cracked it like an eggshell. It was so fragile. He was not happy with how his boat had been treated. September 9th of 1910, he's going to leave Ludington, head into Milwaukee, and somewhere out in the middle of the lake, they don't run into a storm necessarily, a little choppy waves, but if you know anything about Lake Michigan, the waves typically run north and south. But when you're going across the lake, you always have some waves. You always roll a little bit more than, say, an oar carrier that's going north and south on the lake. But it's really not a storm, as you would say. And they noticed some water coming in down below the car deck. And one of the mates went down apparently and claimed there were some deadlights, some portholes below the car deck that were leaking, which shouldn't have been a big deal. Apparently they knew about it for a while, and there was only 3 of them. And so 3 little portholes on a big car ferry shouldn't be that big of a deal. And later on, an oiler was sent down below the crew's quarters to go check on something else. When he got down there, the whole compartment was flooded. And so a mate went down, and they couldn't figure out where the water was coming from. They couldn't pump it out. They had no idea what was going on, other than they were in trouble. So Captain Kilty orders his wireless operator The Pere Marquette fleet was a little ahead of their time. They had all of their car ferries outfitted with wireless radio. And that was pretty rare for 1910 to have an entire fleet outfitted that way. But eventually, I must have hit a button there. The 18 is going to sink. And sadly, 28 are going to go with her, but that's not everyone who was aboard. And those that survived can thank the Pere Marquette fleet because they had that radio. And who heard the call for help? But her sister ship, the Pere Marquette 17. Like I said, don't get confused by the names. One number off. So the 17, just like you see in the Titanic movie, right? They get the call for help and they're pouring the coal to the boilers. They're rushing as fast as they can. And they arrive on scene. And the 18 is still afloat at that moment. But the 17 arrives on what they call the weather side of the boat. So the winds were coming out of the northerly direction, there's the waves, and the 17 arrives on the north side of the boat. And Captain Kildee comes out of the pilot house, grabs his big megaphone, and he yells to the captain of the 17, he says, come around the other side, go to the lee side, where we'll have some shelter from the wind and waves, and we'll get everyone off on that side. And right at that moment, the Pere Marquette tipped bow up and dropped to the bottom. Help was just a couple hundred feet away, but it arrived about 10 minutes too late. Right in front of the 17, everyone got to watch it. But they did save some people, 30, 35 I believe, I might be off on that. But sadly, 2 crewmen from the 17 were lost lowering the lifeboat. They went over the edge of the lifeboat, and so they lost 2 of their crew trying to save everyone else. So when the 18 goes down, this poor boat really had a reputation. This is the Pere Marquette 15. It was busy in Lake Erie at this time, filling in for the lost Marquette and Bessemer number 2. So when the 18 sank, Pere Marquette called it back to Lake Michigan to fill in for the sunk 18. So this poor boat just went through life filling in for its fellow car ferries that couldn't stay afloat. I mean, that was its whole life. The stress of the sinking, sadly, was a little too much for one of the surviving crew members, and he actually went insane after he came back to shore. They found him wandering the docks in Ludington, talking about how Captain Kildee wanted him to ship on the 18. He had to find his boat. He wound up, he actually punched a deputy's lights out because they were trying to, before he went swimming out into Lake Michigan, he actually knocked a sheriff's deputy unconscious with a haymaker, so they had to restrain him. And sadly, he never recovered from it. He got sent off to an asylum in Washington, D.C., and I didn't find anything else about this poor guy. So that was, he survived the sinking, but he didn't survive the stress that came afterward. And then there's some guy in Wisconsin that proposed to raise the car fare. He said, I got this great idea that we can pick this thing back up, fix it up, put it back into service. And it had to deal with compressed air and giant magnets. I want to see those magnets. I really do. But he sort of failed to take into account one minor problem. No one knew where the wreck was. I mean, we knew the general area. There were witnesses to the sinking, but it's in 400 some feet of water somewhere. No one really knew where the wreck was. That sort of required information if you're going to raise it. The sinking of the 18 really hit Ludington hard. If you've ever been there, this sign is in the park right next to where the Badger sails in and out. Mm-hmm. And Captain Peter Kildee was from there, and he was hailed as a hero. He has the captain's story. He went down with his ship. He was directing the rescue effort when his ship sank out from underneath him. The chief engineer was also from Ludington. They had a big memorial service for him. But it's the wireless operator who gets the biggest honor. You can go to New York City and you can find the Marconi Wireless Radio Operators Memorial. And you will find that guy's name right next to Jack Phillips, the wireless operator of the Titanic. So these are on, I think there's about 40 names of wireless operators who actually died in ship sinkings. that were able to call for help and get rescue for their shipmates or passengers. And so this guy is memorialized in New York City, of all places. There's always an investigation when a ship goes down, and the Pere Marquette 18 is no different. They got done, and they said, I don't know, that was the official record right there, I don't know. The inspector said, no clue. Can't find, all I can figure out is it was in great shape when it left the dock for the last time. The 18 had actually been inspected just the day before, and the inspector said, my guys found nothing wrong with it. We have no idea. He did say the idea of the 3 deadlights that were leaking, the 3 portholes, probably not the cause. He said that should not have been enough water to sink a vessel this size. I love this article. The newspaper in Ludington was so proud of their fleet. And it says, surely the lesson taught is clear, and per the superintendent of the Pere Marquette fleet, hereafter all the ferries of the Pere Marquette fleet will be equipped with heavy steel gates 6 feet high, which will always remain closed while the boats are at sea. Duh. Lakemen were saying that from the time the car ferries were first built. You might want to have something big, steel, and heavy to keep water out of our boat. And after the second car ferry sinks, they're all proud of their fleet. They're going to be the first to do it. They're going to put a sea gate on this thing. The sailors have known for a long time. There are stories of car ferries on Lake Michigan sailing 50, 60 miles out of their way because they couldn't turn their sterns to the waves. One of the places they would hide, believe it or not, is all the way up in the Beaver Islands, which is way out of their route. But they would actually sail north to keep the waves away from that open stern. So the sailors are going, finally, and their newspaper is proud, like this is a great aha moment. The inspector had one criticism of the captain and crew, and he said they were too brave. That's not something you hear very often. But he said they failed to understand the danger their boat was in. He said they probably should have abandoned ship much sooner, and they probably just had a little too much confidence in their boat to stay afloat as long as they thought it would. So that was really the only criticism that he could come up with. So the 18 went down. And then things quieted down for a while, until 1929, the Milwaukee. No numbers, right? Finally, a boat with an actual name, the Milwaukee. Stats on her, launched in 1903, she's a big one, 383 feet long. Sailing for the Grand Trunk Fleet. I said no numbers, I lied. When it was launched, her name was the Manistee, Marquette, and Northern #1. That's a long name. So in 1909, when the Grand Trunk Railroad took over her initial owners, they said, let's call it the Milwaukee, that's easier. Plus, we're going to sail it to Milwaukee so it works. So they shortened the name to Milwaukee. And her whole job is to go from Grand Haven to Milwaukee and back. No different than the other boats I've told you about. Her job is to haul rail cars. Until October 22nd, 1929. This is Captain Robert McKay. 50 years a sailor on the Great Lakes. He has a stellar reputation. He's never lost a boat. He's known as an excellent skipper, a very wise sailor. He also has a very unique nickname, Robert Bad Weather McKay. I'm not sure if I really want to sail with a captain whose nickname is Bad Weather. I found this one said Bad Weather McKay. I've heard Heavy Weather McKay. I've also read Bad Weather Bob. I liked that one the most, Bad Weather Bob. And he's going to live up to his nickname because he is also known, he's a company man. He's a railroad man. He is going to stick to his schedule unless something really major happens. He will come through. In fact, when they went to Milwaukee, they sailed through a gale. Not a chop, not minor waves, a full force gale. He got through all the way to Milwaukee, unloaded his cargo on time. And in fact, 3 of his crewmen actually went uptown. They went to the movies. They said, there's no way we're going back. Because once he got to Milwaukee, the warnings got upgraded to a full-fledged storm. So it was supposed to get worse. And they said, we're not going anywhere. So they went uptown, went to the movies, came back to the dock after the movie, and their boat was gone. Bad Weather Bob was not going to be delayed. He left into a storm. Now you might look at that headline and think, okay, they know they have a problem. But just because the car ferries wanted to stay on schedule doesn't necessarily mean they're going to. So yep, they realized that Milwaukee was overdue, but this is a storm. This is a full-fledged storm. Nothing to be concerned about yet. Still no word from her at noon the next day. All right, still within that period of normal. 24 hours go by. Still no word. But there were other car ferries on the lake in this storm. This is the Grand Rapids, and this is the Grand Haven. The Grand Rapids, this is normally a 6 to 7 hour crossing. The Grand Rapids did it in 14 hours. The Grand Rapids did it in 17. So other car ferries were way overdue. The Milwaukee was not alone in this by any means. So they're just still waiting for the Milwaukee to show up in Grand Haven. It just took them a while. Maybe they had to go all the way up to the Beaver Islands. That was a suggestion that had been thrown out. In fact, there had been a report of a car ferry anchored around Beaver Island. So they thought perhaps it was way up there and they were just waiting for it to come all the way back down to Grand Haven. Until the bodies started to be found. The first 2 bodies are going to be found by the vessel The Steel Chemist, 11 miles off of Kenosha. And that raised eyebrows because it was heading to Grand Haven. Why are the bodies being found off the Wisconsin shoreline? One of the watches on the guys was stopped at 9:35 p.m. So that's generally the accepted time the ship went down. And so once the bodies are found, it's pretty clear that the Milwaukee's gone with all aboard. The bodies are picked up off Racine, off Milwaukee itself, off Kenosha. It's off the Wisconsin shoreline. And there was one really sad story. Before the Milwaukee left Grand Haven to go to Milwaukee, there was a coal passer. His job was to just move the coal over to the firemen so they could just shovel it into the boilers. Someone's whole job was not to shovel the coal into the boilers. Their job was to shovel it to the wheelbarrow, bring it to the firemen, and dump it on the deck for the firemen. And that had to be a really fun job. But this guy, he had racked up some time off, so he got off at Grand Haven for a 3-day weekend. Probably rest his back after all that shoveling and wheelbarrowing. So he got off the boat. He had his discharge papers. He was gone for 3 days for a vacation. So he stayed alive. He missed that last trip. The sad part of this story is his dad was an oiler. And his dad didn't take the 3-day weekend. And he lost his dad when the Milwaukee went down. Someone claimed that they had found it right away. They had spotted masts sticking up through the water. People went out and looked for it, and they just found nothing. So that turned out to be a dead end. So the real question is, what happened? Wreckage is found, bodies are found around that 9:30 to 9:45 range. And this even says, you can see right here, they've been hoping that perhaps it was anchored all the way north at Beaver Island, and turned out that was not true. So the question is, what happened? The fortunate thing is we didn't need an investigation to find out what happened. This guy told us. This is A.R. Sadin, Richard Sadin. He's the purser on the Milwaukee. Basically, he's the secretary for the boat. It is his job to keep track of the crew list, keep track of payroll, keep track of cargo, what's in the boxcars, all of that, all the paperwork for the boat. That's his job to take care of. And he had the presence of mind. In this day and age, back then, every boat carried a brass canister about that big around and so long. And so if a ship was in trouble, they could put a note in this canister, throw it overboard, and hopefully it would wash ashore somewhere, and someone wouldn't find it. And so he wrote a whole message. And it was found on the other side of the lake. It was found off South Haven, of all places. All the wreckage was found off Wisconsin, but this thing traveled clear across Lake Michigan back to the Michigan shoreline. And it says steamer Milwaukee, October 22nd, 6:30 p.m. The ship making water fast have turned around and headed for Milwaukee. Now we know why everything was found off the Wisconsin shoreline. She turned around. She went back to Milwaukee. He says pumps were all working, but gate bent. That big steel sea gate that everyone is really happy that they finally put on this thing is bent. Can't keep the water clear. Flicker is flooded. Sea's tremendous. Things look bad. Crew is same as last payroll, A.R. Sadin. This is found about 3 days after this guy dies in the sinking. But he's left us a detailed description of what happened. And imagine this, he's on a sinking boat. This is not, he's not sitting at his desk on a nice peaceful cruise writing a note back home. He's on a sinking ship. This thing has got to be rolling all over the place. It's mass chaos. Guys are trying to figure out how they're going to get off this thing. And he has the presence of mind to not only write a note, but to give details of what happened. That's an incredible thing to be able to do. I'd be, just get me off this thing. Don't give me a pen and paper, get me a life ring now, right? There's some things in here. So 6:30, and you notice the watches stopped around 9:30. So they turned around and they battled their way back for about 3 hours. And they came close. When the wreck was found, it's close enough, I don't know the exact mileage, but they said if it was floating, you could actually see it from Milwaukee. They got that close. We talk about the Seagate being bent. Flicker is flooded. That's a very unique terminology just to car ferries. What is a flicker? That's a flicker. This is the crew's quarters, so this is right below the car deck on a car ferry. So this ceiling, the other side of the ceiling is the railroad tracks where the cars go. This is the crew's quarters. This is where they stay. All these doors here are individual rooms, which just imagine working there. I mean, you're trying to sleep, you got fully loaded boxcars rolling right over your head, man. Good luck sleeping in that. And if you went through this hatch right here, it's a little hard to see in this picture, but that's the engine room. So these guys, they live and sleep down a deck below the car deck. It's called the flicker because the DC electric current made the light bulbs flicker. So they had this real flickering light effect going on, so it was slang for their cruise quarters, became the flicker. And so Sadin tells us that this area was flooded, down below the car deck. Give you a frame of reference, that's about where the flicker would be. Okay, so you can kind of see the main deck, the main car deck here. And so this is down here, so water's getting down to the bottom of the ship. It's not coming in up here, it's coming down there. When the wreck was found, Mr. Sadin was right. The Seagate was bent. Well, more like folded in half. It's a little bit more than bent. If you can imagine, you can see in this picture, these bumps right here, these are the railroad rails. This Seagate should be sitting here. There should be a straight line right across right here, and instead of doing a Z pattern. So the real question is, how does a steel gate like that, and really gate's a bad term, it should be steel wall, it should be a bulkhead, it's solid steel. What bends it like that? Well, when they dove on it, you can't see it in this picture, but down here is the propellers. When they dove down to it, underneath the propellers is a railroad car. So this thing, at some point, at least one railroad car broke loose and crashed right through that steel gate and let the waves roll onto the car deck. Okay, so that puts it on the car deck, but how does it get down below? How does it get to the flicker? How does it get into the engine room? Let's go back to our drawing here. Can't really see here, but I've got some black lines showing up. Right here in the car deck, there's grates. There's an open hatch with a grate in it. Because these are steam engines, they're powered by coal. So if you're a railroad car ferry, you can refuel with coal really easy. You just roll railroad car right over that hatch full of coal, open the bottom, pour it in, and then you roll the empty car back out. It's pretty simple. And so they had these open hatches with grates in them so a guy couldn't fall in. But for a long time, that was it. There was nothing to keep the water out. Here's an article going back to right after the Pere Marquette 18 sank. It said watertight hatches are being built for 2 Grand Trunk car ferries that ply between Grand Haven and Milwaukee. Milwaukee was owned by the Grand Trunk line. That was its route. So this is probably talking about the Milwaukee itself. And it says, these hatches will effectively seal the hatchways into the engine room, the flicker, and all the other entrances to the hold below the car deck. They even put in the newspaper, we are going to seal these off. We're going to get a watertight hatch on it. We are going to button our car ferries up. We've seen enough. We're going to make ours safe. If it takes an extra 10 minutes before we can start unloading, so be it. When they went down to the wreck and they started swimming inside, they got into the engine room, they got into the flicker, and they looked at those grates. There's no hatches. Maybe they got blown off in the sinking, but there's also no combing to dog a hatch down onto. So what it looks like is that these hatches never happened. They never got put on. So once that sea gate got bent and water came rolling up onto the car deck, it just poured through these open grates, flooded the bottom of the boat until she finally just ran out of buoyancy and sank. Now that's 3. I told you there was 3.5 on the bottom, right? Let's fast forward to 2005. Okay? Oh, by the way, the Milwaukee disappeared from the newspapers really quick. That was October 22nd, 1929. That Friday, the stock market crashed and started the Great Depression. So there was not a lot on the Milwaukee after about 3 days. Oops, I keep hitting buttons here. So spring of 2005, there is a group that specifically searches Lake Michigan for shipwrecks and other things. And of all things, they were out cruising around with their sonar searching for an airplane. There was a jetliner that had gone down in Lake Huron, and people have been looking for it for a long time, and they were no different. That's what they were looking for. Except their sonar fish sends up this image. Well, very clearly that's not an airplane. And you see these lines, those look like railroad tracks. Now, these are wreck hunters. They know the stories. They know what's going on. They're going, wait a minute. The history books tell us there's 3 car ferries that have sunk. We know it can't be the Marquette and Bessemer, number 2, because we're in the wrong lake. We know it's not the Milwaukee, because we know where that one is. And we know it's not the Pere Marquette 18, because we're in the wrong part of the lake. But those really look like railroad tracks. So they put a diver down. And they found out that, yep, it's a car ferry. Speared into the bottom of Lake Michigan. There actually was an opening somewhere down here. They got inside it into the flicker and the engine room. Lakes aren't supposed to grow shipwrecks. They're just not. How this works is, the history books tell us about wrecks that we haven't found yet. We don't find wrecks that the history books haven't learned about. It's backwards. So they started asking around, and then some guys went, oh yeah, there was that one thing a long time ago. Winter of 1969, 1970, this guy right here, this is the Ann Arbor number 5. And this is really a famous car ferry. It became known as the Bull of the North. This was the car ferry that would break everybody else out when they got stuck in the ice. Everyone else would be stuck out there for days, and then the Ann Arbor number 5 would show up, break them out in 20 minutes, and away they'd go. Well, when it got retired, it got bought by a company. They used it as, you can see it's been cut down to a barge, right? The sides have been cut down, the upper decks have been cut off. And they actually sunk it right here with these 2 hulls to make a little breakwater. They were doing some piling work for a nuclear plant right here, so they used it as a breakwall. And so it was there for about 2 winters, and then they were done, and so they decided to scrap it out. So they cut up right in place. They cut the whole bow off, all the pilot house, all this. They cut it apart, sold the metal for scrap. And then they said, well, let's pump out the stern section and tow it to the scrapyard because that'll be a lot less time and effort and cost to us. So they're towing this half of a car ferry down Lake Michigan, and it suddenly starts to flood. Oh yeah, you're towing half a boat. Of course it's going to start to flood. There was one guy on board. They were trying to throw extra pumps to him and keep it afloat. And finally they were losing this thing really quick, and the tugboat had a crane on board. They swing the crane over, drop the hook, the guy grabs the crane hook, and they pulled him off as the thing drops off from underneath him. So he's literally plucked off it by a crane. And that's how there wound up being half of a car ferry at the bottom of Lake Michigan that nobody knew about, because they scrapped out all this part. The history book said that it went to the scrapyard, but half of it sank. The history books were half right. The history teacher in me just wants to cry over that. The history books are always supposed to be right. So there's 3.5 on the bottom. And of course, over time, the railroads get better at what they do. Chicago stops being as inefficient as it is, and so the car ferries start to dwindle out. They lasted really until the 1980s. They almost faded out in the 1960s. They got a little bit of new lease on life due to some government help, government programs, but by the 80s, it just wasn't economical anymore. They could just hook up a train and just send it through Chicago. And so the car ferries disappeared, except for one. Yeah, the SS Badger is still afloat. She's not hauling rail cars anymore. She's hauling people and automobiles. It's a really fun trip. I highly recommend it if you ever get a chance. They still have the rails in the bottom on the car deck, but they filled it in up with pavement. So they just drive the cars on now. But the rails are still there. I got an extra secret. I'm not supposed to tell anyone about this, but I got a secret tour of the engine room the first time I sailed on it, and it was really cool. It's actually a National Historic Landmark. So it is the last coal-fired reciprocating steam engine operating in North America. And it is literally a part of US 10. This is considered part of the US highway system. So if you take US 10 all the way as far as you can west, you're going to end up at the Badger dock. And you either turn around or you get on the Badger and you pick up US 10 in Wisconsin. So it's a really nice trip. There actually are 2 car ferries left. The sister ship to the Badger, the Spartan, is still around. It doesn't sail anymore. Let's face it, parts for 1950s era steam engines are hard to get, so they kept the Spartan, and they just take parts off of it to keep the Badger going. They call it the Spartan store. And so she's the last of the entire era of ships. And thanks to it being a National Historic Landmark now, she's going to be around for a very long time. She's really not going anywhere. So that's all I have for you. Thanks for coming out. Questions?
On the Badger, for a while they were going to stop it because it dumps the coal ash into the water.
Yes.
What do they do with it now?
They installed a collection system. So when they come into Ludington, you'll see, once they get the cars off, you'll see forklifts go in, and it's a huge stainless steel canister, and they haul it out, and it goes to Charlevoix and is used in the cement making process in the plant up there. So the ash actually gets recycled and used to make cement.
So that goes from Muskegon to
No, Ludington.
The Badger goes to Ludington,
Okay.
from Ludington to Manitowoc.
There's not one out of Muskegon anymore?
There is, but it is, it's a catamaran. So it's a really weird looking, I don't know, it looks a little too Jetsons for me. I like the old boats. Anything else?
Did they have a car ferry or a rail ferry run from Mackinac to St. Ignace?
They had ferries from Mackinac to St. Ignace, yes. That got into a whole different, there were some that hauled rail cars, there were some that of course hauled automobiles before the big bridge was built. There were other car ferries, you know, across the straits. There was one in the St. Clair River. So in the smaller waterways, there were some, but they weren't the big ships that were crossing the lakes.
How old is the Badger?
The Badger was built in the 1950s. I want to say 1953, 1952. I have to look that up, but yeah, around the early to mid 1950s.
These storms that came up, were they from the south or the north?
Some of each. You know, storms come from all over. Actually, well, the Pere Marquette 18, it really wasn't even a storm. Most sailors didn't even really give it a second thought. It started leaking somewhere. I know the Marquette and Bessemer #2, that storm came more out of the west. Because there was one thought that perhaps he had gone to try to get around Long Point to get out of the wind and didn't make it. The other one, I'm not sure which direction that came from on the Milwaukee. I want to say it came out of the east because that's why he turned around. He couldn't get into the waves, but I'd have to double check that one. Anything else? Don't tell me I did that good of a job. Questions are half the fun. Yeah,
So what does it take for somebody to become a Great Lakes shipwreck hunter?
a lot of money.
Who you have to be?
All you need is a lot of money. If you can buy a boat and a sonar system and learn how to operate it, you can hunt shipwrecks.
So it's all self-funded then? It's not like government help sort of thing? They
It
just do
depends
for
who
fun?
you are. You know, some of the bigger museums get some grants and stuff to do it, but a lot of these wrecks that are found, it's just average people. This is their hobby. You know, one of the premier shipwreck hunters of the Great Lakes, David Trotter, he had a whole career as an executive with Ford Motor Company. So instead of fishing or hunting, he just went hunting shipwrecks. Yeah, and they'll get a group together so people pool their money, you know, but most of it is self-funded. This is just their hobby. So again, lots of money. As long as you can afford the gear, you can go search all you want. Until you cross the Canadian border, then they have a problem.
So what is the issue on the Canadians about the ship hunting?
I really don't know, but everyone tells me that they're a little bit stricter on the regulations and getting a permit to search. Yeah, I do know when they find wrecks, they're not allowed to enter the wreck. They have to stay outside. I was talking with a group that found a couple wrecks in Georgian Bay, and they had to stay outside and peek through the windows. But I don't know if it's probably a respect thing, because you know, people are lost on these things, and unfortunately, I mean, the Great Lakes are fresh water, so people go into wrecks and they find the victims. So I think some of it's just a respect thing.
And you've had problems even getting paperwork out of Canada, right?
Yeah, the National Library of Canada doesn't want to send me stuff because I'm not a Canadian and I don't live in Canada. So fortunately, I know someone who has a friend who lives in Canada. So she orders all the stuff for me, and I pay her back and she mails it to me. But yeah, they won't even open their library to send on Canadians. No.
Given that both would have been bad choices and doomed, you know, you can't pick a good one, but would you rather have sailed under Captain Badweather or Captain Meat Cleaver?
You know, probably Captain Bad Weather, because you know, when you're on a boat, you can only run so far. Eventually, the guy with the meat cleaver is going to catch up to me, so I'll take Captain Bad Weather Bob. You would ask that.